Based on the podcast, one of the important key takeaways that I got was taking medication or drugs is not as simple as we thought it is. It's not simply just taking in your drugs and then transport in your body and now you're done to go. It's actually a dynamic negotiation between psychokinetic and psychodynamic. And it's also involve a very complicated process of the drug's absorption, distribution, and also elimination. For the second question, this podcast session, has helped me to deepen my understanding because it used a lot of metaphor in explaining new things to me. For example, before I actually don't even know what psychokinetic or psychodynamic is. However, the podcast used a metaphor such as commute and office for these two terms. Psychokinetic is actually the commute, which explains how the drugs actually transport in our body, and then psychodynamic is actually the office, which explains about how the drug actually works for our body. Besides, there are many types of drugs. Some of them work slowly and some of them work faster. For the slow one, it is usually in oral form or could be a patch form which you could put on your skin. For the faster one, it could be an IV or any type of drugs that you inject right into your body. Other than that, there are two types of drugs, which is water soluble or lipid soluble. However, the water soluble drugs can't get to our brain. It cannot reach our brain because our brain blood barrier is made out of fat. So in order for the drugs to reach our brain, it has to be lipid soluble because lipid soluble is the only type of drugs that could actually solute in our brain and works for psychological problem. And other than that, I find it interesting. There's this one term called depot binding. So depot binding is actually when the drugs bind to your fat cells, but it doesn't have any effect because it's not reaching to your brain. It's just staying there, it just parked there, and it does nothing to us. However, when somebody lose weight and the fat cells might break down, and the drugs that bind to the fat cells can actually give an effect to the person even though the drug was consumed a long time ago. And other than that, of course, we don't want the drug to just stay in our body and bind to our fat cells. So our body actually do, there's this one magical organ called the liver. So the liver can actually change the chemicals into water soluble, and it could just float in our blood until it finally reach the kidney, and then it is filtrate into our bladder, and finally it came out as a pee. And the other things that I learned from the podcast that I actually find it interesting is prescription for nursing or breastfeeding mothers should be done very carefully. There's this one thing called the iron trap. And this iron trap happen when the lipid soluble that can easily pass through the blood into the breast tissue, and our breast has a very acidic high pH environment. So when the drug actually hit the acidic environment, it can cause a violent chemical reaction. And because it is ionized, it cannot go back to lipid soluble, which means it can't go back to bloodstream and trap in our breast, which can cause the infants or the babies to actually drink the drugs out of the breast. Moving on, let us discuss about the ethical or social issue that has been mentioned in the podcast. So based on the podcast, I heard discussions about how drugs actually works differently for everyone. For example, there's this thing called drug metabolism, which can be different based on gender, age, especially for women or older people, older adults. So it should be a good thing if we are able to create a drug based on what the individuals actually need instead of the drugs that were tasted for one fit all type of people. And drug intake could be different based on demographic, access, or the societal factors. And lastly, for my personal reflection, I believe this podcast hasn't really changed my view on medication intake because personally, I have always been thinking that drug intake are important for those who are in a very critical condition, but it should only be a supporting treatment instead of the actual main treatment. It is important for people who are facing mental illness to get a psychological treatment other than a drug treatment. And from this podcast, I have actually been curious if it is possible to create a drug that is not as harmful as some of these drugs could actually cause to a person. And I think that is all from me. Thank you.